I see 3D homes being able to fit a whole bunch of variety of needs when it comes to this smaller, affordable housing conversation that we're having.
Is 3D printing the future of construction? Join us as we discuss this and more on 3D Print the Future with your host, Frank Awesome.
My guest today joins us from Ontario, Canada. A graduate of both Yorkville and Carleton universities, she is a serial entrepreneur with her sights set firmly on making the world a better place. And she is the owner and CEO at Kelford Youth Services, co-chair at National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness, and chair of Cornerstone Landing Youth Services. She's an active advocate for youth services and safe housing for youth. Please welcome Terrilee Kelford. How are you doing, Terrilee?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great. I'm just so ecstatic to have you on the show because while this is a show really about 3D printing, which is kind of a technology, we really feel so strongly that this is one of these technologies that once we break it into the market can not only help one sort of sector of one industry, like just building cheap houses, but we can really put our energies toward a lot more things if we can get this going. And a lot of those things have a lot to do with building houses. And your experience in life has been completely around how do we make housing equitable for everybody and not just for people with money. So tell me a little bit about what, as a youth, did you have these sorts of issues that brought you into this, or was this something that you kind of noticed as an adult and are now sort of fighting for?
Right. I think probably it was my parents who showed me what it was like for people around us to struggle with poverty. My mother was a teacher and a principal.
Oh, wow.
And so she was kind of one of those folks who fought for the underdog. So she would come home with stories of, kids in poverty and we certainly had, we had extended family members live with us in foster care. And, there was always some cousin living with us at some point for some reason. So, sometimes just for a job, but having people around and knowing that there was poverty and abuse and mental health issues in people's lives was something that I grew up around and just knowing about. And so I think I knew very, very young when I was in high school that I was going to want to work with young people specifically, but also just in the helping profession of some sort. So very young, I started counseling as a volunteer, providing support to young victims of sexual abuse. And then it just kind of evolved from there. I got jobs and I did a degree in psychology. And so
how young were you when you started counseling the kids, the youth? What age were you at there?
Well, I started as a peer volunteer, actually. So I was about 19, I think, when I started my first support group with another counselor.
What was that like? Like what kind of
looking back now, I feel like I knew nothing. I was so obviously I was really lucky to have a mentor who was a therapist who kind of said, yeah, no, I'd love to have sort of a peer support person as well. And so anyways, so she kind of took me under her wing. So it's probably thankfully to her in large part that I'm doing some of the work I'm doing for sure. So including around youth homelessness. But so she allowed me to sort of sit in on groups with her as a co-facilitator. And so looking back now, I feel like I was really young, but at the time I thought I was doing okay. So it's amazing what you learn over time.
It sounded like you were kind of young there. So tell us about your This is kind of interesting because this really is what drives all of our passions to when somebody is entrepreneurial in spirit, but not monetary in mind. You're right. Doing it because you know that you can help people. This is a whole other mindset.
Yeah, well, and I have an interesting background that kind of intersects how, like, my father was a contractor, my brother's a real estate agent. I actually did real estate for a few years as well, just as I call it my mental health break. So, and at the same time, I was always doing work with youth and counseling. So, which, clearly my path has just led me to this whole housing and homelessness piece. But yeah, I actually got a job in a residential treatment center for children when I was 22 years old and finishing up my degree. And about a year after that, the province of Ontario announced that they were going to privatize the child welfare system. And so essentially they closed down all government operated facilities, so foster care, group homes, those sorts of things for kids. So I had a choice. I either had to open my own or go work for a private operator because I loved it. Like, it was as soon as I walked in, I remember my first shift to this day when I was 22, and I loved it. I loved working with the kids. I loved the environment and just being able to spend 24 hours with them and hang out and have dinners and yet have really tough conversations and work through tough stuff with them. But so I opened my own. So at 24, I bought a house, power of sale. That was my first entrance into the real estate game because nobody's going to rent to a group home. So you had to buy a house. And then I had to go through all the zoning amendments. So there was no bylaws to permit group homes. And so I had to do a whole official plan amendment and site-specific zoning amendment. I had to go to an OMB, Ontario Municipal Board hearing to get the site-specific zoning to allow for this group home. So that was my introduction at 24 years old, having to go through this court case to rezone a property. Yeah, but for a social cause, right? Which is really interesting for me because that's kind of the history that I took and the experience I took into the conversation about tiny homes and planning legislation and building codes. So, that started for me way back at 24 and then is serving me well now in terms of the work I'm trying to do around tiny houses. So, yeah. So, I mean, in a strange way, I've always been involved with youth, with counseling, but also housing because we were providing housing to young people. So, and it was because of that work with the child welfare system that we set up a community coalition to actually support young people who couldn't access the services of a child welfare agency, but who were also struggling with housing and homelessness. So, so that was a good 20 years ago in Lanark County, and it's evolved now into a nonprofit charity that's called Cornerstone Land and Youth Services. So we support about 75 or 85 young people across the county of Lanark with either homelessness or housing insecurity and provide them with supports to keep them housed.
Now, do you target, like when you're talking about homeless children, are you talking about, orphans, or are you talking about actual, street urchins? I shouldn't have used that term, but I like English humor, I guess, but, like that sort of, so are you targeting or are people coming to you? How is that working?
Well, both. So we started as volunteers. We were just a board and we were a working board because we didn't have any money for staff at the time. But we were all connected through social services with youth anyways. And so pretty much we knew that there was kids out there, which is why we started the program to begin with. But so, word of mouth and just access to other agencies who would refer kids to us. So we started really small. Like I think we supported about 7 or 8 kids in our first year. And then we got some funding and some grants started coming in. So now we have 2 full-time staff that support kids between the ages of 16 and 24.
Awesome.
And so their backgrounds are really diverse. Like it's either the young person who's been struggling with homelessness since they were 11 or 12 years old, first episode of homelessness, right? But children under the age of 16 have to be referred to the child welfare agency. So we don't typically support that many kids who are under the age of 16. So most of the kids are between 16 to 24. And again, their backgrounds really vary from having been extensively homeless off and on with their families, without their families for a long time. And then also just young people who have, decided by 16, 17, they just can't cope at home anymore and need to be on their own. So yeah, a whole variety of stories for sure.
I definitely, I can definitely relate. Like I was telling you before, I left home when I was 13. My family moved around a lot. I was on the street for a couple of years until I was 16. And at which point, I had a friend whose mom was a psychiatrist and she picked up that I was living on the streets. I was living pretty comfortably on the streets, mind you, but
Yeah.
she sent me to social services and I ended up in a foster home. But, in and out, and just housing for me was never something that was solid. I never had roots. And I know that there are so many people out there, and it's not because I didn't want to. It's not because the desire wasn't there, right? It's because the facilities aren't there. We can't do things quick enough, fast enough. Policy gets in the way. So
Yep.
what are you up to right now? I don't know if you want to describe everything all of your institutions are up to, perhaps maybe just your own personal business, but what are you guys up to? Like what directives are you following right now and what sort of things are you doing?
Yeah, so in Lanark County, specifically with Cornerstone Land and Youth Services, we adopted a Housing First model a few years ago. So we've seen great results as a result of that. So Housing First means that you are providing people with housing as a right. So there's no deciding whether they're ready for housing, not ready for housing. You're just assuming that people need housing and should have housing and finding them housing right away, and then wrapping them in supports while they're there. So what do they need to maintain that housing? So that's really the basis for our program at Cornerstone, and it's worked really well even for young people. So, we have lots of resistance. If you say to people, the 16-year-old, we're going to find, them an apartment, and lots of people are like 16 is too young to have an apartment. They can't have an apartment. Well, that is their alternative. And quite frankly, they do it. And we have 16, 17-year-olds all across this county very successfully living on their own with supports in place. And if they have the right financial support and a roof over their head and stability, they finish school, they graduate, and they move on to college, university, and get jobs, which is what we want for them, right? So, yeah. You just have to kind of faith that kids are quite resilient and actually can take care of themselves quite well with supports in place. So
true.
Yeah, so you just have to have faith that they can do it. So, but we also are working now on affordable housing, because one of the things we're struggling with, and I think all of us right across Canada are struggling with, is affordable housing. And so we're putting out about $30,000 a year in rent supplements right now to support kids in apartments, just in Leonard County alone, and that's all fundraised dollars. So with COVID this year, we've lost a couple of our major fundraisers. So we're really nervous that in a year we won't have that $30,000 to support the kids, which is a little scary to us. And so we started looking at purchasing our own properties. And so that's how I got into the tiny home game, was because in a rural community looking for affordable housing, we didn't want to look at 10 and 20 unit buildings. We actually just want small units with 2 and 3 units in it each. And so in Ontario, the Planning Act was also in the process of changing to accommodate what's called secondary units. And so you're allowed to have a single family home and put a small apartment in it, and then also have a detached apartment in your backyard or side yard as well. And so we really sort of grabbed onto that and started doing presentations before our local municipalities to say, please update your bylaws to accommodate secondary units, because we could then purchase a single family home, put an apartment in it, and use a tiny home in the backyard as a third unit as well. So one single family home becomes 3 units for us. And so that just made sense for us from a rural perspective, from a funding perspective, because if we have to fundraise a down payment, we can do that because we're not going to get multi-million-dollar grants to buy housing here. So it was kind of just the best of both worlds for us. But it opened up this whole conversation about tiny homes, and I research and looking into that, and started to recognize actually that tiny homes is not a new concept. It's an old concept.
Yes, it is.
That we have created barriers and restrictions
Yep.
around to the point where we've pretty much ruled it out. So.
Yep.
So part of it is looking at it as an old concept that we need to revive because of this affordable housing crisis we have right now. So that's kind of the perspective we came at. So we partnered with Algonquin College in Perth,
right.
And very similar to your 3D project, I think that you're going to be trying to do. We did it as a pilot project with Algonquin College. So when we heard all these restrictions and barriers and stereotypes around tiny homes on wheels, we partnered with Algonquin to build one tiny home as a pilot project. And so that's what we looked at it as. And so we wanted to challenge all these stereotypes around, you can't build a house on a trailer to code. And we did, and we went above code. And so and then at the same time, we were addressing some of the barriers around planning and legislation. So at the same time it was being built in a warehouse at Algonquin, I was out doing presentations to councils to see if we could get the bylaws changed to accommodate them too. So we've had some movement in terms of the municipalities and their bylaws, not as much as I'd like to see 2.5 years later after trying to push for this, but tiny home is built and unfortunately is not being used because of the planning barriers right now, but we're still pushing. So as soon as we buy our first single family home, our tiny home will be used as a secondary unit in the backyard. So
that's beautiful. And advocacy, I'm glad you touched on that, because we feel, I mean, we're probably 75% of our efforts right now are spent on advocacy. More than half our team is spent every day on advocacy, writing letters, I've spoken to my MP about, why do we have to have all these restrictions on this old technology that we can now do way better?
Yeah.
Now, another thing you touched on that I'm probably going to get you to talk about a little bit is the idea of the subsidy or the supplement.
Yes.
I'm way against that. Don't get me wrong. I applaud every effort you make to get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, and do what you do. We love that. But I don't feel like I feel like the subsidy of the supplement is a solution that needs we can't keep looking at that as a solution, because I don't think it's a solution any more than putting a Band-Aid on a cut actually heals the cut.
Right.
We need something more solid than that, and that runs right along with why do we have to subsidize things? It's because things are too expensive. So the people with the money have to give money to an organization who can then subsidize the people without the money to have something that they're pretty much entitled to begin with.
Yes,
so why do we do that? Well, we do that because there are corporations and companies out there building houses and stuff who don't care about that. They just care about the bottom line and the profits. We want to change that. We want to make an industry so cheap and so inexpensive that we get our profits and we can offer homes to people without having to pull money to then subsidize these things. They're affording it all on their own 100%. So a lot of your work is in this sort of subsidy area. So what do you see that, how is it as easy as I make it sound?
Well, no, I don't think it's easy, but I do agree with you. I totally agree 100% actually. It's one of the reasons why we're looking at purchasing our own properties, because we're like, why
Hmm.
are we fundraising from the community to give rent subsidies to private landlords who keep increasing their rents to the point where we can't fundraise enough to keep up with it anymore? And so it doesn't make me popular when I talk about this, but I don't ever want to rely on the private sector for housing, quite frankly. And I want to advocate for people to be able to get back in the housing game themselves if they want to. So again, the fact that we've priced housing out of the market for the majority of our population is sad. We have young people staying home until their 30s now because they can't afford their own house. If you talk to young people in their mid 20s, they'll say, I don't think I'll ever own a house because I'll never be able to afford it. Saving up the money for the down payment alone is impossible for me. So I'm just not even going to consider it. But the more we rely on the private market, I think, the less control we have to be able to manage prices. And so right now in Leonard County alone, we have 2 kids sharing a bedroom and paying $900 a month for one room in a house. $900 a month to share a room. So, and that's getting pretty common. Like even in Little Lanark County, rural Lanark County, we're seeing 20 people showing up for one apartment showing, and one bedroom's renting for $1,000 and $1,100 a month. And so, if you're 16 years old and you're only getting $730 a month for your food and your housing, it's impossible. Your rent is like $400 a month more. So, and we have lots of young people working part-time jobs as well, but to go to school full-time and work part-time and take care of an entire household yourself, I mean, those are expectations we don't have for the strongest and most resilient of families who are doing well. So why do we have these expectations for these young people who are struggling to keep their head above water? So I don't think the rent subsidy is a long-term plan, but I think there's lots of people at a national level that would disagree with me. Certainly personal housing benefit is something that the federal government has launched as part of the national housing strategy.
Well, they don't benefit from it, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of taxes that change hands when that money goes back and forth. Am I right? Or is that
Well, the
somehow?
personal housing subsidy typically goes to people who are on lower incomes to begin with. And so it really, what it does is it just allows them the flexibility, which I agree. And I think people should have flexibility in where they live. I don't think people should be forced to have to live in a housing development of some sort. So the idea behind the philosophy behind the portable housing benefit is that it travels with the person. So the person can say, I want to live in that building over there. So here's the rent subsidy, or I want to live in that community over there. Because what's happened is we've created sort of these poverty neighborhoods that people can't seem to get out of, right? And so to allow people flexibility and to blend into different communities prevents you from having rich communities and poor communities, right? It allows more flexibility. However, as the house prices go up, you have to then adjust the subsidies to go up, right? I would rather see, again, more people have the flexibility of choosing their housing on their own personal merit. And also being able to buy a house. I think we need more flexibility about that. So I agree with you 100%. All that to say, I agree with you 100%. We need to get prices down. We need more affordable options for folks, which is really where the whole secondary unit, tiny home kind of conversation came in, because people were looking for more affordable housing options, and they weren't as concerned about size. They just wanted to have their own space that they had a right to. And so that's really how those two worlds all came together for us: homelessness and housing and affordable housing, and then flexibility in terms of what housing types we're offering. So, which is why when I got the message about getting involved in a 3D print project for affordable housing was cool.
Well, these are our people. We love the tiny home crowd, not because they just seem like have a little more common sense to others. I could be a little biased on that, but because these are the kind of folk who would rather be outside than inside.
Yeah.
Who would rather see a huge piece of land like behind me with a beautiful space outside and just enough space to live on the inside when the weather gets down or when you need to hunker down. A smart space, a space that you could build 3 of these for the price of a single brick and mortar house on one of those plots. So the
Yeah.
economy goes up. You've got, now you can imagine behind me there's mom and dad in the big one, grandma and grandpa in the middle one, and then the 2 kids, roomies in the other one. And now they got a whole family there. Everything's been paid for. They designed it on their own. It feels like home. The shapes and what they're looking at, it's theirs. It's not something they found in a catalog, and it wasn't decided by a community group, which is something that I just absolutely abhor.
Yeah.
So these are, I kind of waxing a little bit, but these are some of the hurdles we kind of have to overcome other than just the technology. And it comes back to advocacy: is how do we convince the other half that a neighborhood where all the houses are green except every 5th house is red, why is that good? Why is
Right.
that cool? How is that aesthetic? To me, it's just so many loaves of bread in a shopping store that's just all duck, 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 put in a line. When you see these aerial shots of these neighborhoods, it's just the same roof in different colors, one
Right.
after
Yeah.
another. One's lighter, one's darker, and there's no individuality. So it takes the beauty away from the earth. It doesn't provide economical housing. These things are expensive. They don't last very long. Then most people can't afford them anyways. So when you get into it, now you're just sort of in that sardine can. So I think we got to attack the problem right from the beginning. Is attack the attitudes towards what living is now, and how do we think that we could be better in the future by doing it in the future better. So by building houses that match the landscape rather than the ideals of some, three people on a board somewhere.
Hmm.
So your interest in 3D printing is where did that come from for you?
I think from a call from you guys.
Was it just did Dad just call you and say, "Hey, we're doing this, and you're doing tiny homes," or was it you didn't?
Well, there's actually a mutual colleague, a colleague that's in the housing sector, Jeff Morrison, actually connected us, and
Oh,
so
okay.
worlds came together. But I mean, I joke about that. But ever since I started advocating for tiny homes in all its various formats, I get sent links to housing all the time. Have you seen this tiny home community? I've seen this tiny home. And so I've had many, many, many links to 3D printed homes sent to me over the last 2 to 3 years. So from around the world, people saying, "What about this?" And interestingly for me, because I kind of take I try to be really realistic about it. I want to know how to make legal affordable housing as well. And that's where the tiny home on wheels crowd sort of gets lost in the conversation, because according to building code, there is no way to have a permanent residence on wheels. You actually have to be fixed to a foundation.
Mhm.
And so things like that interest me, because I want to figure out solutions to that. Is there a process? Is there a code? Is there something we need to change to adapt to that? But so for me, I think, again, it's about affordability. It's about how these building models fit into planning and code, so that we can make them viable for as many people as possible. And so when I think about 3D printed homes, it's very similar to the tiny home on wheels conversation, because I think there could be flexibility in it. If you can print off a 400 square foot, secondary unit in somebody's backyard, it might be obviously faster process and more economical for people. So I just had a call in Ottawa from a neighbor, believe it or not, who wants to put in a secondary unit for one of their sons. So and so he was talking about the city bylaws and all the requirements they were having, hoops they were having to jump to make it happen. But I was excited to realize that we might have a secondary unit detached in our own neighborhood right beside me. So I'm like, good, that's what I'm championing the cause of. But so I see, and maybe I'm wrong in this, perhaps you can correct me, but I see 3D homes being able to fit a whole bunch of variety of needs when it comes to this smaller, affordable housing conversation that we're having. So,
Oh, we agree 100%. But I want to make clear that we're not against any other kind of tiny homes, whether it be sea cans or modular, or some companies are 3D printing in foam. We are for every single one of these technologies, and we're for every single one of these technologies succeeding, because the success is not for us. The success is for moving humanity forward, which is something that, industry leaders, anybody that can make themselves an industry leader, I think it's our responsibility to be thought leaders and to say, look, let's get out of this old paradigm, because it's just not working. Even a lot of things we think are working, is it working because it's working, or is it working because we've gotten used to it? I'm half blind. I can drive, I can do lots of things because I've gotten used to it. It might be a
yeah.
bit the same thing. We're kind of running through this half blind, just being okay with it. And I got to a point when I hit my 40s, I was like, okay, I'm not okay with this anymore. And then, 47, 40, 46, I turned, and 3D printing came along and said, okay, look, now there's a solution. Why isn't anybody doing this? And then I found out that people were, and realized, okay, well, we can do this. So I don't want to take away from any of the other industries that are trying to solve the same problems we are, because working together will do it much better. But you're right. We can print foundations in place, and we can print a foundation at any shape. For example, if we go with a robotic arm printer, we can print right next, the legal space from a fence, without putting any infrastructure up or even bothering the neighbors. And we can do it in a day or two. So if we got to bother the neighbors, we say, okay, we're going to be in here for 48 hours. we'll get it signed, and we're gone. It's not two
Yeah.
weeks of construction, which for a tiny home, what they're great, but it's still got to build it, either build it in some warehouse and have it shipped,
Mhm.
and then, or you
Yeah.
got to build it in place. We could come in and just print it. And then the only
Yeah.
work is another day of lining and doing, whatever electrical stuff that happens.
Yeah, and in terms of the conversation around affordable housing, that's one of the issues that we're struggling with in Canada right now. Is a lot of the contracts to build affordable housing were 25 to 30 years ago, and those contracts are running out. But there also wasn't enough funding provided to do the maintenance required. And so even in Lanark County, for example, we lost 60 units of housing because after 3 years they had to be torn down. And so, then you got to come up with the millions of dollars to rebuild it again. So you're going backwards as much as you're going forwards right now across Canada. It's one of the reasons why we have a housing crisis, because we're losing almost as many units as we're building right now. So you will see announcements for new housing all the time, but we're also losing units all the time too. Yeah. So if we could actually solve that problem so that we're actually building inventory, not losing inventory, we would be ahead of the game right now.
That's super interesting. Attrition has never come up in any conversations I've ever had about housing. And that's, wow. Like, talk about, the little needle that's pricking your skin that you can't find, that little sliver you can't find. Attrition of homes. I'd never, ever considered that.
Yeah.
And that's changing my outlook a little bit right now. That's
Yeah.
really interesting. So I really do like to sort of keep steering this towards the 3D printing area,
Yeah. Of course.
because I do think that it can solve all of the things that you're working towards.
Yeah.
You could use it as your hammer and nail and just bolt forward with it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of issues we have to solve, a lot of obstacles we need to overcome. But assuming that we solve all the physics, let's
Mhm.
say we please all the politicians and they're all like, "We love you guys, you're awesome. Let's do everything you say." Can you see this being a welcome solution to the world's housing crisis? Now, not just in Canada, but can you see this in, 50 years or even 100 years from now being sort of the normal way that we deal with housing crisis?
Well, to be honest, I probably don't know enough about the technology, but I think if anybody could come up with an affordable, long-term, sustainable solution, that's, I also believe in smaller housing. I think that's part of the issue too, lowering footprints on the planet as well. So I think if you can meet those, tick all those boxes, I think, why would anybody object? So
Yeah, true enough.
now, in saying that, I also know that, people have fought me pretty hard on tiny homes, and although the conversation's evolving and attitudes are changing, anything new or perceived as new is always challenged, right? So, I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle, is just to prove that it can last 200 years when there hasn't been one yet that's lasted 200 years.
And
So,
it'll take 200 years for us to do that.
yeah. Do you know what's changing the conversation thing too? Is that there's more and more people, like, when you talk about homelessness, there's all kinds of stereotypes, it brings out the worst in people when you have conversations about homelessness,
It can.
and why we're homeless, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what's changing the conversation, I find, is that a broader audience is requiring and wanting smaller, more affordable housing options. And so the broader the audience, the more will you have to create solutions for that, right? So, for example, seniors on fixed incomes only have about $500 a month for housing. So when you say publicly that we've got thousands of senior single ladies and men in this province who are on the verge of homelessness because they can't afford housing anymore, that's a big, powerful group of voices who can advocate for more solutions. And so same for parents who have children with disabilities who want an independence type oriented housing option for young people. They're a big, strong force that can advocate for these solutions. So I think when the conversation becomes broader, which is really how I went about it ultimately, I said, look, this isn't going to just help youth. This is going to help all of these other groups. Then the conversation started to evolve, and now I get stories all the time. I get people calling me saying, I want to put a tiny house on a piece of land I have. Do you have any suggestions for how to go about the bylaws? And so that helps. So I think you have to get past that hurdle first, right? You need to change the conversation to make it broader.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you probably have that in your favor, because I think lots of people across Canada right now are looking for more affordable, greener options for housing. And I think the speed of which you can build is going to be a huge asset as well, right? I think that's one of the frustrations too now, is that, it takes a year to build a secondary unit in someone's backyard, which seems so silly. So our tiny home is 6 square feet, and we actually just built it for short-term housing, not long-term housing, but and it took about 5-6 months. We thought we could knock it out in about 60 days, and it took almost 5-6 months to do it. So from top to bottom.
It takes longer than people think. from start to finish?
Yeah, yes, for sure. Yeah, and we luckily we had Algonquin's indoor warehouse space, so we could build it over the winter inside. But yeah, it was definitely shocking to us. We thought we would have it done by Christmas, and it was like July by the time we rolled it out the next year. So I think if you can get past those hurdles, absolutely. Why would anybody in the world not look forward to that kind of solution, right? I think we're desperate for sustainable, green, affordable solutions.
So has this kind of changed your mind? And you've just obviously just been recently introduced to 3D printing as construction to begin with. Has this sort of changed your outlook on what you're going to do with your businesses and like how you're going to help the youth? And, you know, has it made you sort of go, well, maybe, a tiny home on wheels isn't the way to go? Are you seriously looking at 3D printing as one of your personal solutions?
Well, I'm curious to follow along because I mean, I have no objections to it based on the way it's been described to me. I can't imagine why I would have any objections. What I'm always curious to learn, because I like to learn as well, is just how it's going to fit within codes and how you're going to meet all those
Mhm.
requirements. And like I'm looking at this picture behind you of the three houses on one property, and all my brain is screaming, going, "That's a planning problem. You're not going to get three houses approved on one piece of land in Canada."
These are
So,
real, actually, built
yeah.
by SQ4D.
I'm curious about that piece because I think the more industries we have, whether it's 3D printing, tiny home movement, whatever it is, that's fighting for the same planning
Right.
principles and the same code requirements,
Hmm.
the more strength we have, which is kind of what I'm referring to when I say broadening conversation, right? I think the more people we have pushing for these things, the better. And look, I think people are interested. I think you just have to present them with the reality. The one reason why I think the tiny home on wheels industry is still struggling is because people are looking for affordable options. There's lots of them who are not meeting codes and don't want to. They kind of just want to fly under the radar, be off the grid, and park their house on wheels somewhere on a remote lot somewhere. The unfortunate part for that is you can't advocate for an industry if it's not a legal industry, and so it's a bit of a balance between trying to figure out how you meet both of those needs. So how do you make it affordable but also make it legal? And so that's kind of the conversation I try to walk down the middle of. I understand why people want this, but I also understand that we need to find a way to make them legal so more
Right.
people can have it. So people are kind of always flying under the radar with these little secret tiny homes running around. It's
Well,
not
we've
gonna.
actually kind of given some consideration to that, and we realize that the codes have to be kind of different for a 3D printed tiny house or any tiny house for rural or non-rural, right? So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges they're coming. They're trying to make up rules for two different things because they think it's the same thing. So you're not really just building a tiny home. You're building a tiny home in the city on it's a granny house behind someone's house in the city with utilities and all this wonderful stuff. Or you're just putting some on your own plot of land. There has to be different rules for that. Is that something you guys consider?
Yeah, well, and so because we are in rural, right? So and yet the biggest uptake for secondary units, which are primarily tiny homes on a property, right? Not on wheels, but typically slab on grade
Gotcha.
in a city. The urban centers have a bigger uptake for it than rural communities do right now. Rural communities are actually giving us a harder time planning wise than urban centers are. So
Really?
urban centers are looking at things like laneway housing and
Yeah.
garden suite secondary units and that sort of stuff. So yeah, the rural communities are definitely dragging their heels, in my opinion, in terms of approving these things. We have some rural townships are like all over it. Tay Valley Township, for example, in our area was like the first. They were all over it. So they're very accepting of these new creative sort of models for housing and secondary units and multiple houses on one property, which is great. Yep, a lot of slow conversations
Weird.
happening.
Do you think that's indicative of the people that live there, or do you think that's because the leaders are just deciding, like a community association, they're deciding what's best for the community? So what do you think? Do you think it's the people that are of that opinion, or do you think it's more of
Well, in
the
rural
leaders?
communities, I think you're relying on rural municipalities. So you're going to have 5 or 6 people who've been elected officials to make these decisions around official plans and zoning bylaws, and you do have planners typically hired or shared amongst different townships and stuff in small communities. But so it depends on their philosophy and personal attitudes as well, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
um, and there's a lot of disconnection between the different ministries as well. So people who are planners don't necessarily understand building codes. So I heard from planners all the time that the minimum square footage required in the code for housing was 600 or 700 square feet because that's what their bylaw was drafted as. They were shocked to find out that the minimum square footage for a single family home in Ontario, according to the code, is 145 square feet plus a washroom and laundry.
145 square feet? That blew me
plus
away just now. What?
plus a washroom and laundry.
Oh
So
my
yeah,
God.
so you can, so that's why our house at 196 square feet meets code. And so we did everything to meet code with that. So, but you will find minimum square footages in towns as high as 1,000 square feet. You are legally not allowed to build a house smaller than 1,000 square feet, even though a lot of those rural communities are full of wartime houses that were built in the 40s, which were 400 or 500 square feet when they were first built. So, yeah, so over time we kind of developed this bigger is better mantra. And so I think, and we're communities as we are in urban centers, I think, right? So, and then people worry about property values and all this sort of stuff. So you have to go through all those kind of hoops, right? Which you will hear as well. So if you have, if you become the first community to have a 3D printed house, you're going to have neighbors say, "How's that affect my property values?" Right?
They
So
are, and that's where I think we've really got to be really careful about aesthetics when we do these things. It can't look like some of the ones that be printed, like in Ecuador, where they are. To me, these are just some of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen.
yeah,
To a layman, they look like somebody just slapped mud in layers on top of each other and put some wood
right,
roof on top, right? They see the steel
right,
struts holding the roof up and think to themselves, "Oh, we can't even hold up a roof." Like, no, this is, you know. So I think we have to go past doing it in a way that's just very economical and works, and go past that and work with the land, work with the area. So if you go into an area of the city and do a granny house where most of the houses fall into the white gray category and stucco, which is
mm-hmm,
pretty common for yards, for your areas with big yards. So we're going to go in there and we're going to print, or at least cover what we print in a material that sort of matches that.
mm-hmm,
If we're out in somebody's lake and it's really hilly, we might print them hobbit holes,
mm-hmm,
to go completely on the other side of the spectrum, right?
yeah,
So the idea to get acceptance, I think you hit the nail on the head, is not, they're not so worried about how they're going to last 1,000 years, but how is that going to affect my property value? Is it
yeah,
going to make the property value in the neighborhood go up? And I think it's going to make it go up. I don't know anything about it, but I can't see putting something as an added value service. That's how I make a little more money. I give added value services. I give my main services for a decent price, and then anything extra I do is value added, and I make extra on that. And that's, to
yeah,
me, what this is all about. So how could that
yeah.
possibly make? Am I wrong about that? Is there any possible way that a 3D printed home or any tiny home could drop the price? That this doesn't make any sense to me the more I talk about it.
Well, so as a single family home, you would certainly get some argument even from realtors. I always find realtors. My brother's a realtor. I love him. He's the most honest man I've ever met, and he does all my real estate for me. But there are some other realtors, not so much. they,
Okay.
they tend to tell people, what they want to hear. So if I hear one more time from a realtor told me that this could devalue my house, I want to pull my hair out. And I also was a realtor for a while, so I'm like, it's just not true.
But
So,
realistically, when you
but
do that, what actually happens?
realistically, no, and I actually had a question for tiny homes because that was one of the first things I heard was, if you put a tiny house beside my big house, it's going to lower my property values. And so we kind of skirted that by having the secondary unit conversation and just saying that, look at, if you put a secondary unit in your backyard, you're going to have to pull a building permit, and the building permit is going to flag an assessment of your property, and chances are your taxes are going to go up because you have an additional property.
Oh,
But if your taxes go up, it means the value of your house has gone up. And if the value of your house has gone up, that means the value of your neighbor's houses have gone up, because that's how house sales work. It's about average sale prices in the house. So you never want to be the most expensive house in the neighborhood. You want to be in the middle or the bottom, because you're going to be pulled up by all the other houses. So if your house goes up in value through a tax assessment, it means that everybody's house is potentially going to go up. So there is no argument to say that a secondary unit is going to devalue your property. That's just not true.
but it does cause
So
other challenges.
but you will, yeah, get increased taxes for sure. But in this kind of a housing market, really, I mean, the extra $100 a month you might pay in your taxes is going to be made up for by the rental income or the family member that can stay there, contribute towards the cost. So, anyways, there's not much of an argument there for me. I mean, I had to go through that when I was 24. I was 24 years old and had to look up group homes across North America and how that was affecting property values. And there was all kinds of research out there to show that a group home next door to you does not devalue the property values, because one house, one building does not have an overall effect on the entire neighborhood. It's actually the opposite. The entire neighborhood has an effect on that property. So, anyways, I think it's an interesting, I think there's an argument for all of this. And I think there's enough cases out there with unique houses, new houses, that you can address all of these barriers as they come up. And I'm guessing that the 3D conversation is going to be almost identical to the conversation we've had to have about tiny homes, which is why I'm really interested in being involved in some level. So
I agree entirely. And you know what? We're going to have to talk about this again, I think, in 3 or 4 months after we've gotten a little bit further on. We've got some pretty good news coming up in the next month or so that I can't talk about now, but I can't wait to share the news and then see where we're at, because I know this is new for you as well. And we'll have to have a talk and see if either of us have made any progress. I'll be interested to hear if you got that land and you got that stuff up, especially if you've then contacted us to go ahead and print your 3D home on there. That would be just fantastic. Yeah. So I think we're gonna end it for today. Just to keep it nice and light. I want to thank everybody who's come and listened to the show. I hope you guys really found that interesting. It's something that we're really going to have to look forward to if we're going to do 3D printed housing at all. It's not just about the technology, it's also about the advocacy. So we've got to get the message out there, share the word, let everybody know that we can solve not just a few problems, but a lot of problems with this. Of course, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. You'll get notified when another video comes up. Also subscribe on podbean.com as well. All the links are going to be at the bottom. I want to thank Terrilee for coming to the show today. We really appreciated having you today.
Happy to be here. Yeah, it's great. Looking forward to having these conversations.
All right, so we're gonna have Terrilee back again, and we're gonna follow up and find out if both her and us have followed up on our own plans. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.
3D Print the Future is sponsored by 3D PHC. Find them on the web at www.3dprintedhomescorporation.com.